father's dark secret, a sinister past that destroyed his family, criminal story. Sara had always regarded her father, Martin, as a model of virtue and integrity. In their small suburban town, where life moved at a deliberate, predictable pace, Martin stood as a symbol of dependability. He was the kind of man everyone trusted. From the neighbors who called on him for advice to the local business owners who counted him as a loyal client, Martin was the embodiment of the American dream, a hard-working, reliable man who built a stable life from the ground up. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Sara's childhood was filled with the kind of moments that seemed like perfect snapshots of suburban bliss. The little house they lived in was always warm, always inviting. On weekend mornings, Sara would wake to the smell of her father's coffee brewing, his deep voice humming along to some old song on the radio. The scent of fresh-cut grass would drift in through the windows as Martin worked in the yard, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, calloused forearms. His steady hands fixed everything: plumbing, fences, cars, relationships. No problem was too large for him to solve. And in those moments, Sara couldn't imagine a world without him. He was everything to her: protector, provider, counselor, and guide. From her earliest memories, Martin was the foundation upon which everything else in her life rested. When she was younger, he'd tell her stories of his adventures in his 20s, before he met Sara's mother. He spoke of his travels, his brief stints in odd jobs, and his carefree days. But those stories always ended abruptly, never lingering on too many details, and always with the same comforting line: "But I settled down when I met your mother." That was the turning point. For Sara, that was enough. Her father's stories, filled with mystery and excitement, were always far removed from the life she had known. They existed like fables, part of his past, which she was content to leave untouched. Life, as she saw it, was perfect. There was no reason to doubt her father's sincerity or the purity of the family they had built together. Everything, from the warm dinners to the family vacations, was a reflection of the love and effort her father had put into creating their world. The town they lived in was quiet, nestled in a valley surrounded by hills and small forests. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, but still respected boundaries. Sara attended the local school, where everyone knew her as Martin's daughter. Her father's reputation preceded her wherever she went. He was well-liked and admired by teachers and parents alike, known for his honesty, punctuality, and his commitment to his family. There were no scandals, no rumors, no reason for Sara to question the world she lived in. Despite the small-town charm, there were always moments that hinted at something beneath the surface. Martin was not a man to open up easily. Conversations about his past were always vague, peppered with moments of discomfort whenever his younger years were brought up. Whenever the topic turned to his youth, Martin would change the subject quickly, always redirecting attention to the present or the future. He'd say things like, "That's behind me now. No need to bring it up," and Sara, understanding but not pressing, would comply. It was during one of these routine moments of silence that Sara first noticed something strange: an old, dusty box tucked in the far corner of the basement. The basement was a place that held various odds and ends from their family's history: old furniture, forgotten clothes, boxes of Christmas decorations. It was a space that seemed frozen in time, untouched and disorganized. One rainy afternoon, after her father had gone out for errands, Sara ventured down to the basement to rummage through some of the old family items. She'd been looking for an old photo album, one that contained pictures of her as a child. But as she searched, her eyes fell upon the box. It was an unremarkable cardboard box, covered in years of dust and cobwebs. What caught her attention wasn't the box itself, but the name scribbled on it in faded ink: Martin Harris, 1985. Her curiosity piqued. Sara gently pulled it out from beneath a pile of old newspapers and opened the lid. Inside, she found a mixture of old documents, faded photographs, and yellowing letters. Some of the papers were clearly legal documents, and her heart quickened as she sifted through them, scanning the names and dates. It was one document in particular that stopped her in her tracks. It was a police report. The details were sparse, but enough to make Sara's blood run cold. The victim's name was Gregory Myers, and the incident described was nothing short of horrific. A violent altercation, a murder, and an investigation that, for some reason, had been kept quiet. The date on the report was 1985, the same year scribbled on the box. The connection was undeniable. This was her father's past, one that had remained hidden for nearly 3 decades. Sara's hands trembled as she read the report. She could barely comprehend what she was seeing. Her mind raced, trying to process the information. This couldn't be real. This had to be a mistake. Martin, the man who had been a stable force in her life, had been involved in a brutal murder? It didn't make sense. How could the man who had given her everything, who had always been there for her, be connected to something so horrifying? The document spoke of a violent argument between Martin and Gregory Myers, a man with whom he had once been friends. The specifics of the altercation were vague, but the report mentioned a fatal stabbing, with Martin being listed as a key witness, or perhaps a suspect. Her father's name appeared in several places, but there was no conclusive proof linking him to the crime. Still, it was enough to make Sara feel as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. She sat frozen in place for what felt like hours, clutching the report to her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: confusion, fear, disbelief. She couldn't fathom how this could be true. How could the father she knew, the man who had been so loving and dependable, be involved in something so violent? Her sense of reality was beginning to fracture, and she felt as though she were losing her grip on everything she had ever known. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers. But a deeper, more paralyzing fear gripped her. What if he denied it? What if he tried to explain it away? What if this was the beginning of a nightmare that would change everything she thought she knew about him? And more importantly, what if he had been living a lie all these years? With shaky hands, Sara carefully folded the documents back into the box and shoved it to the back of the shelf, out of sight but not out of mind. Her father's return was imminent. As she heard his car pull into the driveway, her stomach twisted into knots. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. For the rest of the evening, Sara was distracted. She barely touched her dinner, and her mind kept returning to that police report. Every time she looked at her father, she saw something different, a stranger hiding behind the familiar face of the man who had raised her. Was this the same person who had comforted her when she had scraped her knee as a child? The same man who had taught her to drive, to love, to trust? The questions gnawed at her all night. She couldn't sleep. How could she go on living in this house, with this man, knowing what she knew now? How could she pretend everything was normal when the walls around her were closing in? But no matter how hard she tried, Sara couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was, had already begun to unravel the life she had always known. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Sara resolved to confront him. She couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. She needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. She had to know if the man she loved was the man she thought he was, or if he had been hiding something far darker. As she prepared for the conversation, her mind swirled with possibilities. Would he lie? Would he confess? Or would he deny everything, leaving her to wonder if her discovery was just a cruel mistake? Whatever the outcome, Sara knew that her life would never be the same again. The calm she had always known had already been shattered. Now the storm was coming. The morning after Sara's discovery was an eerie one. The sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of rain, mirroring the turmoil that churned inside her. The house felt too quiet, too still. She couldn't shake the image of the police report from her mind, its stark, cold language that seemed to haunt her every thought. Gregory Myers, a brutal murder, and her father's name, unmistakably written in ink across the pages. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the words again, like they were branded into her brain. Sara felt as though the ground beneath her was slowly eroding, and the life she had known was slipping through her fingers like sand. As she made her way downstairs that morning, the smell of bacon and eggs wafted up from the kitchen. The familiar scent of her father cooking breakfast hit her like a wave of disorientation. She stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, listening to the sound of his voice humming along to the radio. The tune was familiar, something he often sang while cooking, a simple, soothing sound that had always made her feel safe. But now, it felt like a mocking reminder of the life she had lost. How could this man she thought she knew so well, have hidden such a dark, violent secret from her for so long? When she entered the kitchen, her father looked up from the stove, flashing his usual warm smile. His blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he greeted her. "Good morning, sweetheart. Sleep well?" His voice was calm, steady, too steady. The normalcy of it all made Sara feel dizzy. She could hardly respond. Her throat felt tight, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out his words. Her hands shook as she took a seat at the kitchen table. She felt as though she were about to step into a world she no longer understood, a world where her father was not the man she thought he was. "Yeah, I slept fine," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. I have something I need to talk to you about." Martin paused in the middle of flipping a pancake, his brow furrowing slightly. The silence that followed felt thick, pregnant with the weight of unspoken tension. "Sure, what's on your mind?" He turned his attention back to the stove, but there was something in his posture now, something almost imperceptible, that gave Sara the feeling he already knew what she was about to say. Her hands trembled as she reached for the newspaper she had taken with her to the table. She unfolded it slowly, the sound of the paper crinkling too loud in the quiet room. Then, with a deep breath, she placed the police report she had found in the basement directly in front of him. The sight of it, so simple, so stark, seemed to freeze the air around them. Martin looked at it for a long time without saying anything. His grip on the spatula tightened, his knuckles whitening. The smile had disappeared from his face, replaced by a look Sara had never seen before, an unreadable, almost distant expression. His gaze shifted from the paper to Sara's face, and for the first time in years, she saw something like fear in his eyes. "Where did you find this?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "In the basement," Sara said, her voice cracking. "It was in a box with your name on it." She paused, watching his reaction closely. His face went pale, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if he were trying to hold something back. He turned his back to her briefly, as if collecting his thoughts, before setting the spatula down and sitting at the table opposite her. He exhaled sharply, a sound that was almost a sigh of resignation. "Sara, I didn't want you to know about this," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to find out." The words hit her like a slap. "What do you mean? What is this? What's going on, Dad?" Her voice cracked on the last word, the confusion and hurt rising in her chest like a wave she couldn't hold back. "How could you keep something like this from me? How could you hide this for all these years?" Martin closed his eyes briefly, as though he were bracing himself. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, but the weight of his past seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. He didn't speak right away, and Sara could see the battle raging inside him. The calm, steady man who had always been so open and forthright now seemed like a stranger, someone torn between guilt, fear, and the need to protect his family from a truth he couldn't bear to confront. "Before I met your mother, before I came here and started this life with you and your mom, I was different," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was young, reckless. I made mistakes. Some of those mistakes were unforgivable." Sara's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced with the implications of his words. Before your mother, before the family, before the life she knew. What was he talking about? She clenched her fists under the table, her nails biting into her palms. "You were involved in a murder, weren't you?" The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them. The question was harsh, accusatory, but it hung there between them like a truth she had no way of avoiding. Martin's face went ashen, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on the table, as if ashamed to look her in the eye. Sara felt her stomach twist. This was real. This wasn't some mistake, some misinterpreted document. Her father was not just hiding something small, something insignificant. He was hiding something dark, something that had the potential to destroy everything. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
Yes, I was involved in that.
But it wasn't as simple as you think. He met her eyes then, and there was something in his gaze, something that softened, just slightly. I didn't do it out of malice. It was an accident. But it happened, and I had to live with the consequences of that for the rest of my life. Sara stared at him, her heart racing. An accident, she repeated, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside her. You killed someone. And it was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen, Martin said quickly, his voice trembling. I was young, stupid. I had a temper and things got out of hand. The man I killed, Gregory Myers, he wasn't just some stranger. He was someone I had known. We had fallen into bad habits, gotten involved in things we shouldn't have. And one night, everything went wrong. I lost control. Sara's head was spinning. She could barely process the words he was saying, let alone the emotions they stirred in her. You lost control, she repeated, her voice rising with each word. You killed him, and then you just ran? You ran from your past and started a new life. What about the people you hurt? What about me? Martin's face contorted with guilt, and for the first time in their conversation, he seemed to break. His voice cracked as he spoke again. I was a coward. I didn't know what else to do. I fled. I changed my name, moved here. I met your mother, and thought maybe I could build a new life, start over. I thought if I kept my past buried, no one would ever have to know what I did. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I never wanted you to be a part of it, Sara. I never wanted you to find out. Sara sat there, stunned, her mind racing. It felt as though the world around her was collapsing. Everything she had known about her father, everything she had believed to be true, was now in question. How could this be the same man who had raised her with love and care? How could he have concealed such a monstrous act, hidden behind a mask of normalcy for all these years? You think I won't understand? Sara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. You think I can just forget this? That you can just explain it away, and everything will be okay? Martin's face twisted with regret. I never wanted you to have to understand, Sara. I never wanted you to carry this burden. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Sara felt the weight of her father's confession settle into her chest, her stomach twisted in knots. She had always believed in him, trusted him without question. But now that trust felt shattered, irreparable. The man who had been her rock, her guide, her protector, was someone she no longer recognized. And as she stared at him across the table, she realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was now unavoidable. The man who had been her father had a past that would forever haunt their family. For Sara, there was no going back. The life she had known was gone. The storm had come. Sara's world had cracked wide open. Her father, Martin, the man she had trusted her entire life, was a murderer. The horror of that simple fact settled heavily on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. The revelation that he had killed someone in his youth wasn't just a terrible story, it was a fundamental betrayal of everything she had believed about him. But it was the silence that followed her father's confession that haunted her most. She had expected anger, maybe denial. Instead, she had received an explanation that only raised more questions. Her mind kept returning to that police report in the basement, the mention of the victim's name, the violent nature of the crime, and the haunting possibility that this was far from an isolated incident. Her father's tearful apology, his insistence that the murder had been a mistake, seemed hollow. It wasn't just the murder that bothered her, it was the decades of lies. The fact that he had kept this secret from her mother, from everyone who had ever known him, was what truly tore at her heart. The following days passed in a blur. Sara could hardly focus on anything. She would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, and find herself staring at the ceiling, her mind unable to process the truth. The sound of her father moving through the house, cooking breakfast or fixing things in the yard, no longer comforted her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of dread, as though the man she thought she knew had become a ghost, someone wearing his skin but no longer recognizable. Despite the tension that now filled their home, Sara couldn't bring herself to confront him again. She was paralyzed, torn between needing to understand more and being terrified of the truth that might come out if she pushed him further. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep living in this house without knowing what had happened. She had to confront the past, even if it meant losing everything she had once known. That afternoon, she drove into town. She told herself it was just to clear her head, but deep down, she knew she was searching for something, anything, to help make sense of the madness that had upended her life. As she drove through the quiet streets, past the local grocery store and the coffee shop where she and her father used to stop on weekends, a feeling of emptiness overwhelmed her. It was as though the town itself was in on the lie. Everyone knew Martin as a respectable man, but none of them knew the truth. They had no idea who he really was as or what he had done. Sara's mind drifted back to the police report, to the strange details she couldn't fully grasp. Gregory Myers was a name that echoed through her thoughts like a bell tolling in the distance. The incident had happened almost 40 years ago, and from the report, it seemed like no one had ever been charged with the crime. There were hints of a cover-up, a hidden truth that had been buried for years. Sara couldn't help but wonder why. Why had the case been so carefully kept under wraps? Was her father the only one involved in the murder, or was there something more? There were still too many unanswered questions. And that, more than anything, was what scared her. The drive took her to the local library, where she had spent hours as a child, lost in books. The library was quiet, its tall shelves of dusty volumes stretching up to the ceiling. It was the last place Sara had ever expected to go to look for answers, but she needed to know the full story. She couldn't live in the shadow of this secret without understanding the extent of it. The idea of confronting her father again, without the full knowledge of what had happened, felt impossible. She needed more information, more context, something that would allow her to piece together the story of what had really happened. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Kelly, smiled warmly when Sara entered. She had known Sara since she was a child, and there was a familiarity in the way she looked at her now, a kind of gentle concern. Sara didn't want to seem odd, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the town was full of ghosts, people who had known her father and yet knew nothing of what had happened in his past. "Can I help you with something, dear?" Mrs. Kelly asked, her voice soft but kind. Sara hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I need to look up something. A case that happened here a long time ago. Something that may be connected to my father." Mrs. Kelly raised an eyebrow but nodded, leading her to a row of old newspaper archives. "We've got records going back decades. If you're looking for something about the police reports or old cases, this is the place to start." Sara felt a wave of anxiety wash over her as she pulled out a few bound volumes of newspapers from the 1980s. The name Gregory Myers kept echoing in her mind. She flipped through the brittle pages, scanning the headlines and stories, until she finally came across something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There it was, a headline from July 1985. "Local man found dead in alleged altercation. Investigation underway." The article detailed a violent confrontation between Martin and Gregory Myers, which had escalated to a fatal stabbing. The article didn't go into much detail, but it described the shock the town had felt when the news broke. The story was vague, and the police were reportedly still investigating. But one line stood out to Sara. Authorities declined to comment on the involvement of anyone connected to the Myers family. Sara's heart raced. Why had they declined to comment? Why hadn't the police named names? The story made it clear that something was being kept secret, but what? She felt a cold chill run down her spine. Was it possible that there was more to the story than her father had admitted? She scrolled through more articles, but nothing seemed to offer any concrete answers. In the following weeks, the case had seemingly disappeared from the public eye. The newspapers stopped reporting on it, and the story faded from the public consciousness. It was as if the town had deliberately chosen to forget about it. But Sara couldn't forget. The drive home was long and filled with a quiet sense of dread. Sara's mind whirred with questions, and every thought seemed to lead to more confusion. What was her father's role in this? Was he involved in the murder, or had he been a victim of circumstance? And if he had truly killed someone, why had he chosen to flee rather than face the consequences? Why hadn't he told her the whole truth? She couldn't shake the image of her father from her mind, the way he had looked when he confessed. He hadn't seemed remorseful. He had seemed terrified, as if he knew that his past would eventually catch up with him. But Sara was determined to understand. The man she had called her father had hidden something, and it was time for her to find out what that was. That evening, after dinner, she finally confronted him again. She couldn't let the fear rule her any longer. She needed to know everything. "Dad," she began, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and frustration. "There's something I don't understand. The papers, they said that the case was still under investigation back in 1985. But you've never mentioned anything about a real investigation. You never told me about anyone else being involved. Was this really just an accident? Or is there more to this story than you've told me?" Martin's face went pale, and his eyes darkened. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked down at the table, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "I didn't tell you everything, Sara," he said softly. "There were people involved, people who helped me cover it up. It wasn't just about Gregory. It was about making sure I never had to face what I'd done. I ran and they helped me. They made sure the investigation went nowhere. But I swear to you, I didn't kill him because I wanted to.
It was never about that.
It was self-defense. And I never thought I'd have to face the consequences." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with guilt and unspoken fear. Sara felt as though her world had just shifted again. There was so much more to this story, things her father had hidden from her, from everyone. And as much as she wanted to understand, she now realized that the truth might be more than she could bear. Her father had already paid the price for his past by living a lie for nearly 40 years. But now, Sara knew, the truth would no longer stay buried. There was no going back. The past had found its way into the present, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days felt like a blur. Sara couldn't bring herself to leave the house, nor could she face her father. The weight of his confession hung over them both like a heavy fog, and every room in the house seemed charged with an energy she could no longer name. Martin had retreated into a cold silence, as if to give her space to process what he had confessed. But his withdrawal made the house feel even more oppressive. The life they had shared before now seemed like a distant dream, an illusion shattered by the terrible truth that had been forced into the open. Sara knew she had to make sense of it all, but every time she tried to gather her thoughts, they scattered like leaves in the wind. The story her father had told her was far from the whole truth, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she truly knew about him. She had spent her entire life believing that Martin was the model of integrity and strength, that he was a man who would never falter. But now, every memory of him seemed to shift, to distort in her mind. How could she reconcile the father who had held her hand through childhood with the man who had killed someone in cold blood? She began to spend hours alone, wandering the house, staring at old photos that once brought her comfort, but now only made her feel lost. There was one photo, in particular, that haunted her, a family portrait taken just before her mother's death. It had been a happy day, a rare one where the four of them, Martin, Sara, her mother, and her younger brother, Evan, had spent an entire afternoon together, laughing and playing in the backyard. Sara had always cherished that memory, the laughter in her mother's eyes, the warmth of Martin's smile. But now, looking at it, she felt a deep sense of loss. What had been real? What had been a lie? Her father hadn't changed. He was still the same man in so many ways. He still cooked breakfast every morning, still fixed things around the house, still held on to the same old habits. But there was a gulf between them now, a rift that had only grown wider in the days that followed his confession. The silence between them became unbearable. Every word that might have healed the fracture seemed impossible to speak. Yet, Sara knew that to move forward, she would have to confront the things she had been avoiding. She needed to understand what had happened, what her father had done, and whether there was any truth in the story he had told her. The worst part of it all was that she didn't know if she could ever truly trust him again. One afternoon, after a sleepless night spent tossing and turning, Sara made the decision to go to the police station. The idea of speaking to someone who knew the details of her father's past, someone who might be able to fill in the gaps, felt like the only way she could start to understand the twisted narrative she had inherited. She couldn't afford to let the confusion continue to consume her. The questions in her mind were suffocating. Why had her father killed Gregory Myers? Was it really self-defense? Was he telling the truth? And if he wasn't, what other lies had he woven around the incident? Sara had always been a curious person, but the enormity of the situation made her nervous. It felt wrong, somehow, to dig into her father's past. But what other choice did she have? If she couldn't trust him to tell her the full truth, she would have to find the answers herself. The police station was a small, one-story building on the outskirts of town. It had always seemed like a place where nothing truly happened, a place for traffic tickets and lost property reports. The idea of going there to seek answers about her father's past made her stomach turn, but she couldn't ignore the urgency she felt. The past was no longer something she could just walk away from. It was a part of her now, and the only way to reclaim some semblance of control was to confront it head-on. She walked through the heavy door of the station, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the heat of the summer day. The officer at the front desk looked up, his bored expression shifting slightly when he saw Sara. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. "I'm looking for information on a case that happened about 30 years ago," Sara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "A man named Gregory Myers was killed, and I need to know more about what happened." The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. His eyes narrowed, and he glanced quickly over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. "What's your interest in that case?" he asked, his tone suddenly more cautious. Sara hesitated. She wasn't sure how much to say. She had already told herself that she wasn't there to accuse anyone, only to understand. But she could feel the weight of the officer's gaze. Was he hiding something too? "I'm just trying to understand what happened," she said, her voice faltering. "It's something connected to my family. My father, Martin Weller, was involved in the incident." She couldn't stop herself from adding the last part, even though she had only just begun to piece everything together. The officer seemed to register her words with a sharp intake of breath. He didn't respond immediately, but after a few moments, he motioned for her to follow him into a back room. Once inside, the officer shut the door behind them. "This case isn't something that's talked about much around here," he said quietly. "But I'll tell you what I know. You're not the first person to come looking for answers." Sara's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension in the room building. "What do you mean? Was there more to this than what I've been told?" The officer hesitated, then sighed deeply. Gregory Myers was found dead in an alley, stabbed multiple times. No witnesses, no clear motive. But there were rumors about your father, about him and Myers having some kind of connection. They were both involved in some shady business, from what I hear. There were whispers about debts, about violence. But no one was ever charged. It just disappeared. He looked at Sara, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. "You've probably heard the rumors, but no one ever did anything about it. Not officially, anyway." Sara felt her stomach churn. Shady business? Debts? What was this man talking about? Her father had never mentioned anything like that. He had always spoken of his youth as though it were a distant, embarrassing memory, a time when he had made mistakes, sure, but nothing that could come back to haunt him. To hear that there might have been more to the story was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. "I don't know what you're implying," Sara said, trying to steady her voice. "I'm just looking for the truth. Was my father involved in the murder or not?" The officer's face softened, though there was still a tension in his eyes. "Your father wasn't directly responsible for Gregory's death. but he was there that night, and he was part of what happened. There's more to the story than just a case of self-defense, believe me. But I can't say more. Not without putting myself at risk." Sarah's heart raced as she processed the officer's words. Part of what happened? That was all he would say? What had her father really done? The truth seemed to slip further and further away, like a mirage just beyond her reach. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of which brought her any closer to understanding what had truly happened that night. When she left the police station, she felt sick. The officer's words haunted her. There's more to the story. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. On the one hand, it seemed like a confirmation of what her father had said, that it had been an accident, that he hadn't been the sole cause of the tragedy. But on the other hand, it left her with more questions than answers. If her father wasn't directly responsible, then who else was involved? Who had been protecting him? And why had they kept the case buried all these years? Back at home, Sara felt as though the walls were closing in on her. Her father had told her that he had run because of his guilt, but now she wondered if there was more to his flight than he was letting on. She had already seen how willing he was to lie, to protect himself, to protect their family. What if he was hiding something even darker than she could imagine? As the days wore on, the emotional weight of it all became unbearable. Sara tried to engage with her father, tried to find the right words to open up the conversation again, but each time she found herself retreating, unable to face the man who had once been her hero. The silence between them stretched on, thick with the unspoken tension of things that could not be undone. But she knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. She would have to keep digging, keep asking questions, even if it meant unraveling everything she had ever known. Because the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. The moment the truth begins to surface, it seems to come with an immediate cost. But for Sara, the cost would soon turn out to be more than she could have ever imagined. What she thought would be the final step in uncovering her father's secrets, the moment of confrontation where everything would finally make sense, had only opened the door to a far more complex and dangerous reality. After visiting the police station and piecing together what little she could, Sara returned home that evening with a sense of determination. The small snippets of information she had gathered from the officer confirmed that her father's involvement in the death of Gregory Myers was far more than a simple case of self-defense. There were debts, rumors of violence, and a web of secrets that stretched back to her father's youth. But that night, something within Sara shifted. She could feel that the tipping point had been reached. The truth she had been chasing had become undeniable. No longer was she the child searching for answers. She had become the agent of truth, ready to expose everything that had been buried. As Sara sat at the dinner table with her father, the strained silence hung between them like a physical barrier. Martin didn't look at her, his face drawn and weary, as though the weight of the past was pressing down on him from every angle. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed food around his plate, unable to meet her gaze. "Sara," he said quietly, his voice low and resigned. "I've already told you everything I can. You don't need to go any further with this. It's in the past and it's over." His eyes finally met hers, but there was no warmth in them, only fear. "I'm asking you, for your own sake, to leave this alone." Sara could feel the power in his words, the desperate plea for her to stop digging, to forget the things she had learned, and to return to the comfortable lie they had lived in for so many years. But she had already gone too far. The truth was already out there, clawing at the edges of her consciousness. She couldn't just go back.
Not now.
Not after everything she had uncovered. She needed to finish what she had started, no matter the cost. "Dad, you can't just ask me to let this go," Sara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "You told me it was self-defense, but I've seen the papers. I've heard the rumors. There's more to this. I need to know what happened. I need to understand why you really ran away and why you've been lying to me all these years." Martin's face twisted in pain as he stood up abruptly from the table, knocking his chair back with a loud scrape. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice rising. "You have no idea what you're asking. The past is gone, Sara. It doesn't matter anymore. You're my daughter, and I swore to your mother that I'd protect you from all this. You have to trust me. For your own sake. You need to leave it alone." Sara stood up too, her heart pounding. The sharpness of her father's voice cut through her like a blade. It was the first time she had seen him truly lose control since her mother's death. She had always known him to be strong, stoic, dependable, but now she saw the cracks in that armor. The fear was real. She was forcing him to relive the horrors of his past, horrors he had buried deep for decades. And she couldn't help but wonder what lengths he might go to in order to keep her from uncovering it all. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I'm not going to stop. You've kept these secrets for too long. You think you're protecting me, but you're not. You're just trapping us both in a lie." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. For a moment, it seemed as though Martin might collapse under the pressure. He lowered his head, his hands shaking at his sides. Then, with a sound that was almost a sob, he let out a breath and looked at her. "I never wanted this for you," he whispered. "I never wanted you to know the truth. But now you do. Do you want to know what happened that night?"
Fine.
"I'll tell you, but you won't like it. You won't be able to understand it." The air between them grew still. Sara felt a coldness seep into her bones as her father's confession hung on the precipice. There it was, the moment that would either break their family for good or allow them to start rebuilding the crumbling trust between them. "You're right," Martin continued. "It wasn't just self-defense. It wasn't even about Gregory. It was about me trying to escape a life I couldn't control. I was involved in things, in people that I shouldn't have been. There was money involved.
Drugs.
Violence. The kind of opal I thought I could use to get ahead, to build a better life. But everything went wrong. And when Gregory came at me that night, I was already in too deep. I didn't just defend myself. I killed him because I thought I had no other choice. I had no one left. No way out." Sara felt the ground beneath her shift. The story her father had told her, his self-defense claim, now felt like a faint echo, a half-truth woven around a much darker reality. He hadn't been innocent in this at all. And now, it wasn't just the murder that seemed so impossible. It was everything else that had been part of it. His escape, his lies, his involvement with dangerous people. It was as though the man she had known as her father was a complete stranger. "And then what happened?" Sara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like they were coming from someone else, someone detached from the pain of this moment. She was numb. She had to be. She had to hear it all. Martin's face crumpled with regret as he sank into the chair again, his hands covering his face. "I ran, Sara. I ran because I was scared. And I promised myself I'd never look back. I left everything behind. I changed my name, came here, built a new life. I never thought it would catch up with me, but it did. It always does." Sara's chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and grief. Her father had not just been a man with a dark past. He had been a man who had chosen to abandon everything, his family, his responsibility, to escape the consequences of his actions. And now, she was paying the price for his choices. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Sara didn't know what to say. What could she say? The man she had loved, trusted, and depended on had not only been a liar but a coward, a man who had abandoned the very people he was supposed to protect in order to save himself. And now, Sara was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world that had once seemed so secure. "Is that why you've been so distant all these years?" Sara finally managed to ask. "Is that why you kept so many secrets? Because you were running from what you did? From who you are?" Martin's head dropped into his hands. He nodded, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his confession. "I didn't want you to know, Sara. I wanted you to have a normal life. I thought if I could just keep this from you, maybe you could escape the same fate. But I can't keep it from you anymore. I see it in your eyes. You know everything now." Sara felt the full force of his words crashing over her. He had kept this from her, thinking he could protect her by sheltering her from the truth. But in doing so, He had built a prison for both of them, a prison she could no longer ignore. "I'm sorry, Sara," he said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you from this. From my mistakes." For a moment, Sara stood frozen, her mind reeling from the enormity of what she had just learned. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand that he feel the weight of what he had done. But in the end, she simply nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The man she had always admired was now someone she couldn't even recognize. And the worst part was that, deep down, she knew the truth was only the beginning of a much darker journey. The night after the confrontation with her father felt like the aftermath of a storm. Sara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the images of her father's confession from her mind. His words echoed over and over, each repetition like a dull hammer strike to her chest. The truth about her father's past, the web of lies and violence, had shattered the reality she had lived in for so long. But what hurt even more than the truth itself was the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. There was no turning back now. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders with a suffocating intensity. She had always believed that the truth was something that could set her free, that once she knew everything, she could make sense of the world around her. But now, Sara understood that the truth was not always liberating. Sometimes, the truth was a prison, and now she was locked inside it. Sara had always admired her father. He had been the cornerstone of their family, the steady force that had provided, protected, and held them all together. He was a man who had shaped her world with his unshakable presence, his warmth, his insistence on keeping everything in its place. But that image had been a lie. Her father, the man she thought she knew, was someone else entirely. He was a killer, a coward, and a man who had abandoned his past and his family in a desperate attempt to outrun the consequences of his actions. And now he was asking her to let it go. But Sara knew she couldn't. She couldn't pretend that she hadn't learned what she had. The knowledge of her father's dark past was not something she could unsee, no matter how much she wished she could. Every time she looked at him now, she would see the murderer he had once been. The truth hung between them like an invisible wall, separating them more than any distance ever could. For days, she had wandered the house in a daze, unable to find peace. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. Her mind kept racing, replaying the words her father had said, trying to make sense of them, trying to understand how a man could live two lives so completely apart from one another. But the more she thought about it, the more everything seemed to fall apart. She had tried to reach out to people, tried to find some sense of solace in the few friends she had left. But even they were distant now. Her best friend, Rachel, was sympathetic but couldn't fully understand. She had known Sara's father as a quiet, kind man, not the monster he had been in his past. No one else knew the truth. No one else could help her shoulder the burden of this knowledge. And the few times Sara had tried to talk about it with Rachel, she found herself retreating into silence, afraid to voice the horrors that were still too fresh in her mind. She knew she needed to face her father again. She needed to understand what had happened, not just for the sake of her own healing, but for the sake of their family, if such a thing could still be salvaged. But that meant confronting the hardest question of all: what did she want from him now? Was there any possibility of forgiveness? Could she ever look at him the same way again? It was during one of these long nights of internal struggle that Sara finally realized the magnitude of what had happened. Her father had confessed to a murder, a brutal killing that had destroyed a man's life, and in some ways, had destroyed Sara's as well. But there was something deeper at play here, something that transcended the crime itself. This wasn't just about Gregory Meyer's death. It was about everything that had led to that moment. It was about the choices Martin had made to abandon everything and everyone he had ever cared about to escape the consequences of his actions. Sara thought about her mother. How would she have felt about all of this? Would she have forgiven Martin? Would she have even believed him? Sara had always admired how her mother had been able to maintain a sense of peace, despite everything they had gone through as a family. But now Sara realized that even her mother had been living in a lie. If she had known the truth, would she have stayed with Martin? Would she have raised Sara in this house, under this roof, with this man? Knowing what he had done, the realization was a brutal blow, and Sara felt it in her bones. She had been raised in a house built on lies, in a family that had never really been whole. The trust she had placed in her father had been a fragile thing, and now that trust had been shattered. She couldn't just go back to the way things were. It was impossible. She would never be able to look at him the same way again. Sara realized that the victory she thought she had achieved, the victory of knowing the truth, was nothing but an illusion. It hadn't freed her. It had trapped her. The more she learned, the more she understood that the truth was not some clear-cut thing that could be packaged and filed away. It wasn't something that could be easily categorized into neat little boxes of good and bad. The truth was messy, complicated, and painful, and it had consequences. Serious consequences. The first consequence was the growing distance between her and her father. They no longer spoke, except in strained exchanges that were more like formalities than real conversations. Every attempt to bridge the chasm between them felt futile. Every word they spoke seemed to widen the gap even further. And as much as Sara hated it, she couldn't stop herself from pulling away. She had no idea how to move forward with him. How could she? The foundation of their relationship had been cracked, and no amount of words could fill the void. The second consequence was the growing sense of guilt that Sara began to feel. She had wanted the truth. She had insisted on it. But now that she had it, she realized that she wasn't sure how to handle it. The truth had given her no answers, only more questions. What did it mean to be a daughter of a man who had killed another? What did it mean to love someone who had chosen violence over family? Could she ever forgive him? Could she ever truly forgive herself for having demanded this knowledge, for forcing him to confess? The guilt began to eat at her, gnawing away at her sense of self. Was she being selfish? Had she destroyed everything by wanting to know the truth? And even worse, did she still owe it to her father to protect him, to shield him from the consequences of his actions? She wasn't sure anymore. But what she did know was that she was no longer the same person she had been before this all began. She had seen too much. She had heard too much. The truth had taken its toll. On the 5th day after their confrontation, Martin approached her in the kitchen while she was making coffee. He seemed smaller somehow, the weight of his own guilt hanging on his shoulders like a physical burden. Sara didn't know what he wanted, but when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost pleading. "Sara," he said, his words slow, as if each one was carefully chosen. "I know you hate me right now. I know you can't forgive me.
But I need you to know something.
I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted you to be caught up in this mess. I wanted to protect you. I just didn't know how." He looked at her, his eyes tired and filled with regret.
I'm sorry.
"I'm sorry for everything." Sara stood frozen for a moment. The words he had spoken were exactly what she needed to hear, but at the same time, they felt hollow. She had heard him say sorry so many times over the years, and each time it had meant something different. But now, his apology wasn't enough. It was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. "I don't hate you, Dad," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I just don't know who you are anymore." The truth had cost them both more than they were prepared for. Martin's past had been the shadow over their family for years, and now that it had been exposed, the light had come too fast, too harsh.
There was no escaping it now.
There was no undoing what had been done. Sara didn't hate her father, but she couldn't love him the way she once had either. The price of the truth was not just the destruction of their family, it was the destruction of everything Sara had believed about herself, about her father, and about the world they had built together. And now she would have to learn how to live in the ruins. The weeks following the revelation of her father's dark past felt like an endless series of shifting tides. Sara's world was no longer the safe, predictable place it once had been. Her relationship with her father had become strained, distant, like two strangers forced to share a home. Each day, the weight of the secret between them grew heavier, and the once comfortable silences were now filled with tension and unspoken words. But Sara had done the unthinkable. She had uncovered the truth. It was a truth that had been buried for years, a truth that no one had ever wanted to confront. And now that it was exposed, she could never go back to the world she had known. She couldn't simply erase the pain or the betrayal she felt. Yet, in some strange way, there was a small measure of freedom in the truth as well. It was a bitter kind of freedom, one that didn't offer comfort but offered clarity. No more lies. No more pretending. The hardest part was accepting the fact that the man she had once called a hero was not the person she had thought him to be. Her father was a flawed, damaged man, just like everyone else. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. But Sara wasn't a child anymore. She had to learn to face the truth, to accept it, and somehow find a way to live with it. It wasn't just her relationship with her father that had been affected. Everything about her world felt off kilter. She had always believed that her family was a unit, that no matter what, they could weather any storm together. But now, the very idea of family seemed like an illusion. Her mother's death, her father's silence, and the terrifying reality of his past had turned everything upside down. She had seen the cracks in the foundation, and now she understood that the walls of her family had been built on lies, on the kind of secrets that could shatter everything. She had tried to reach out to her old friends, but it was clear they didn't understand.
How could they?
How could anyone who hadn't experienced what she had? No one had the right words, no one had the right answers. And so, Sara retreated inward, feeling more alone than ever. But in the quiet of her apartment, late at night, when everything else was still, she found herself thinking about the future, about what came next. What could she do with the truth she had uncovered? Could she move forward with her father, or was the chasm between them now too wide to bridge? Could she ever rebuild the relationship they had once shared? And, perhaps most importantly, could she ever forgive him? Those questions gnawed at her, like an open wound that wouldn't heal. They kept her up at night, running through her mind in a loop, trapping her in a cycle of guilt and uncertainty. There was no easy answer, no quick fix. The truth had shattered everything, but it also forced Sara to examine herself in ways she never had before. She had thought of herself as strong, as someone who could weather any storm. But now she realized that strength came not from hiding from the truth, but from embracing it, no matter how painful it might be. One evening, after a long day of work, Sara found herself sitting in front of the television, trying to distract herself from the thoughts that haunted her. But as she flicked through channels, her mind kept drifting back to her father. She wondered where he was now, what he was doing, whether he was struggling as much as she was. He hadn't spoken much in the last few weeks, and their few interactions had been awkward, strained, as if they were two strangers forced into the same space. Sara realized that, for the first time in her life, she didn't know who her father was. Not really. And that truth, while painful, was something she had to accept. She had to stop clinging to the image of him that she had built over the years and start seeing him for who he truly was. But that didn't mean she had to forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be demanded, and Sara wasn't sure she could offer it. The next day, Sara decided to visit the place where it all started, the house she had grown up in. The house that had always felt like home, until it didn't. It was strange to be there again. The walls seemed smaller now, the rooms emptier. The memories were still there, though faded echoes of her childhood. She walked through the familiar hallways, pausing in the kitchen where her mother used to sit, where her father would tell stories about his day. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, and for a moment, it almost felt like things were normal again. But they weren't normal.
They couldn't be.
Sara's eyes lingered on the hallway that led down to the basement, the place where she had first uncovered the documents, the place where everything had unraveled. It felt like another lifetime now. As she stood there, staring down the long corridor, she wondered what it would have been like if she had never discovered the truth. Would she still be living in the same world, believing that her father was the man she had always thought him to be? Would she still be at peace, unaware of the darkness that had shaped her life? The temptation to retreat, to bury the truth and go back to the way things were, was strong. It would have been so easy to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter. But deep down, Sara knew she couldn't do that. The truth was a part of her now. She had to face it, and she had to face him. Later that evening, after hours of wandering the house, Sara found herself standing in front of her father's study. The door was closed just as it had always been, but it no longer seemed like a place of safety, a sanctuary where her father went to read or write. Now, it felt like a fortress, a place where her father hid from the world, from the truth, and from the consequences of his actions. It was a symbol of everything he had kept buried, everything he had tried to outrun. She knocked softly, hesitating before turning the handle. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. Her father was sitting at his desk, papers scattered in front of him, his face weary as he glanced up. "Sara," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "I think we need to have a conversation about everything." He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. It was as if he wasn't sure what he could say that would make things right. "I know I've hurt you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can never undo what I've done. But I need you to understand that I never wanted any of this. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to find out what I did. But I can't hide it anymore. I can't lie to you." Sara's heart tightened as she listened to him. She had heard the apology before, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just an apology. It was the admission of a man who had been living in the shadow of his own guilt for far too long. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," Sara said softly. "But I don't think that's what I need right now. What I need is for you to understand what this has done to me. To us. I can't just go back to pretending everything is okay. It's too late for that." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, but it was also necessary. Sara didn't need her father's forgiveness, and she didn't need his approval. What she needed now was to move forward, to find a way to live with the truth, to find a new sense of peace in the face of everything that had changed. "I don't know what comes next," Sara said finally, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I can't stay here in this house, in this life. Not like this. I need to figure out who I am now, who we are. And I can't do that while I'm trapped in the past." Her father nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I understand," he said quietly.
Idiot. Ust.
"I just want you to be okay, Sara. That's all I've ever wanted." Sara took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what the future held. She didn't know if she could ever repair her relationship with her father, or if she even wanted to. But one thing was clear. She had to keep moving forward. She couldn't stay frozen in the past, clinging to the remnants of a life that no longer existed. The truth had changed everything. And now, it was time to embrace the future, armed with the knowledge that there was no going back. As she stepped out of the study and into the quiet hallway, Sara felt a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had seen the darkness, had faced it, and now she was ready to move on, armed with the truth and with the strength to live with it.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.